unbiased reveal channel, trying our best to cut through the geopolitical static and, well, give you some clarity. Today, we are definitely plunging into a recent international powder keg. It's been a bit of a whirlwind week, hasn't it? You've got Israel launching these pretty significant strikes against Iran's nuclear sites. They're alleging an immediate threat. And then, bam, Iran hits back. Direct retaliatory missile attacks, wounded hundreds in Israel. This whole escalation, it's really put the world on high alert. Global powers are, scrambling for diplomacy. Meanwhile, regional tensions, they're simmering like never before, an all-time high, probably. Okay, let's unpack this. Our mission today, really, is to sift through all these swirling reports, the conflicting claims, the high-stakes chess moves, and try to give you the clearest possible picture of what's actually happened on the ground. We'll dig into the why behind it all, the what happens now bit, and maybe some surprising connections that make this deep dive pretty interesting.
Absolutely. And it is definitely far more layered than just the headlines would suggest. You've got this really complex interplay going on, historical grievances, strategic calculations, even, well, existential fears on both sides. So yeah, our goal is to dissect these elements, look at them from different angles so you can form a more informed perspective, beyond just the immediate boom and bang.
Exactly. And when we talk about the initial sparks, the thing that really kicked this off, it takes us right back to Iran's nuclear ambitions, doesn't it always?
Yeah.
So the conflict officially began, June 13th, 2025, with an Israeli offensive hitting Iran. Now, this wasn't just out of the blue. It came right after a pretty significant declaration from the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency. They basically said Iran had violated its nuclear non-proliferation obligations.
Right, and then IAEA declaration. It's really crucial context here. You have to understand what that means. When the IAEA, the World Nuclear Watchdog, says a country has violated its obligations, well, it usually points to specific breaches, things related to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty's safeguards. For Iran, this often means enriching uranium beyond the levels needed for just peaceful energy. That's usually around 3.67% purity. But we hear reports frequently of Iran enriching to 20%, sometimes even 60% purity. That's way beyond typical energy needs. And it's technically just a short step away from weapons-grade uranium, which is usually around 90%. It can also mean they aren't being fully transparent, not declaring all their nuclear materials or facilities, raising flags about hidden activities. So for Israel, this declaration, it basically handed them a justification, albeit a very controversial one, for their preemptive strike. It let them frame it as countering a direct threat.
And here's where it gets, really messy. Fascinating contradiction, actually. Because while the IAEA did note this non-compliance, its Director General, Rafael Grossi, he later seemed to dial back the alarm bells a bit. He stated there wasn't actually evidence Iran was actively trying to build nuclear weapons. So, okay, on one hand, you've got these explicit violations, but on the other hand, the head guy says, hold on, they're not actually building a bomb right now. It's like getting a ticket for speeding, but the cop says, yeah, you were speeding, but you weren't, trying to get away from me, which is okay.
Well, that apparent contradiction, it really highlights this whole dual-use dilemma with nuclear tech, doesn't it? It's a massive point of tension in international relations. I mean, Iran might not be actively putting a bomb together piece by piece right now. But because they have this advanced enrichment capability, they could theoretically switch to weaponization much, much faster than a country without that infrastructure. This idea, it's often called breakout time. And that's what keeps international watchdogs, and especially regional rivals like Israel, constantly on edge. It turns even what Iran calls peaceful progress into a potential strategic threat down the line. Iran, of course, they immediately hit back, accused the IAEA of being complicit, providing a pretext for the Israeli attack. Their foreign ministry spokesperson directly said Grossi and the IAEA's reporting was biased and just used as an excuse. So it really seems like everyone has their own version of the facts in this high-stakes blame game. It just underscores the incredibly deep distrust here.
Exactly. It's less about finding a shared truth and more about, pushing competing narratives. Each side crafts their story to fit their agenda. The sequence is clear, right? IAEA report comes out, then boom, Israeli strike on June 13th. That happened. But why it happened and what it really meant, that's just a swirling vortex of claims and counterclaims. Which brings us right to the core nuclear. Well, let's call it the nuke ant, shall we? Just how close is Iran to getting the bomb? Israel very emphatically claims Iran was weeks away. Just weeks. Now, if you've been following this saga, and let's be honest, who hasn't, this line sounds familiar. It's been a recurring theme for decades, which prompts some people to kind of roll their eyes and say, yeah, I've been hearing that for decades now.
That weeks away narrative, you're right, it's a very persistent theme, almost a constant drumbeat in the story of Iran's nuclear program. And it does raise that important question. What has actually stopped Iran from crossing that final line for all this time? Or has the threat itself been the strategy? Giving Iran leverage without actually facing the full global backlash of having the weapon. It's been this long, drawn-out game of cat and mouse. Iran always seems like it's just about to get there, but never quite finishes the race. But what might make this current situation feel different, and certainly more alarming for Israel and others, is that Israeli intelligence dossier reportedly had genuinely new information, stuff suggesting a more immediate sprint towards capability.
Right, and this is where the intel gets really juicy. These new files, they apparently detailed the formation of something called a Special Progress Group, formed about 6 years ago, maybe, supposedly under Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, the scientist Israel, reportedly took out back in November 2020. And this group's alleged mission, to basically lay all the groundwork meticulously so they could weaponize much faster if, and it's a big if, the Supreme Leader gave the green light. Make a rapid dash for a device. And here's the real kicker, according to this intelligence. This Special Progress Group apparently ramped up its research and prep work significantly at the end of last year.
Yes. The intelligence seemed to point to a new incentive driving this faster pace, apparently stemming from, well, the perceived limited impact of Iran's earlier missile attacks on Israel, and also the reported depletion of their own air defenses after Israeli strikes back in October 2024. So, this suggests maybe a strategic rethink by Iran. Perhaps they felt they needed a stronger deterrent, something more definitive. And critically, the intelligence also reportedly mentioned a scheduled meeting, a meeting between these nuclear scientists and commanders from the IRGC Air Force, the guys responsible for ballistic missiles. Now, that proposed meeting, that was a huge red flag for Israeli intelligence, because the missile chiefs were allegedly going to be briefed on this secret program for the very first time, which strongly suggests that planning for the mating process that's integrating a nuclear device onto a missile warhead was potentially on the immediate agenda. Now look, miniaturizing a nuke and getting it onto a missile successfully, that's incredibly complex engineering. It can still take a lot of time to actually master. But if this intelligence is accurate, it would signal a shift from a long-term worry to a much more imminent threat of deliverable weapon. That changes the calculation dramatically.
And the targets Israel hit seem to confirm this focus, right? They went after the nuclear stuff. They successfully penetrated the underground Natanz facility. Radiation was detected inside. That's not nothing. It means a direct hit on a key part of their enrichment setup, deep underground. Iranian authorities, maybe trying to manage perceptions, claimed the leak was under control. No radiation escaped. Okay. Meanwhile, the Fordo site, the one buried super deep under a mountain like 100 meters down, that was reportedly not hit, which just underscores how tough that particular nut is to crack, the sheer challenge it represents. But even with the Natanz hit, Iran's stockpile of enriched uranium, supposedly enough for, 12 to 24 bombs, that reportedly remained intact. Iran's Atomic Energy Organization did acknowledge the damage, though, said they must decontaminate the Natanz site. So this penetration, it really marks one of the most serious blows yet to Iran's nuclear infrastructure. So the question isn't just, are they weeks away? It's more like, have they been doing this nuclear cha-cha for decades, maybe just for strategic show, or is this finally the grand finale we've all been wondering about?
And that intense focus on nuclear progress feeds directly into Israel's justification for acting, dismantling what they frame as an active doomsday clock. Their primary argument rests on Iran's open, declared top priority to destroy Israel. That's the language they use, which leads them to pose that rhetorical question. What do they want Israel to do when Iran literally has a doomsday clock counting down to Israel's destruction? So from Israel's perspective, this framing makes it an existential struggle. It's against a radical leadership where, in their view, peaceful coexistence just seems fundamentally impossible.
Right. So Israel is essentially saying, look, we've been living under this shadow, this explicit threat to our existence. And when we finally act to dismantle their military capability, we're painted as the bad guys.
Okay.
It's a really complex position in a very high stakes game. But here's where you see an explosive crack, an internal contradiction right inside the Israeli leadership. Israel's defense minister, Israel Katz, he went way further than Prime Minister Netanyahu, didn't he? Katz stated that Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, can no longer be allowed to hold power, specifically citing him personally ordering attacks on hospitals.
That is a direct, very public call for the removal of Iran's top leader, coming from a senior Israeli cabinet minister. And it contrasts starkly with Netanyahu's more, shall we say, cautious stance. Netanyahu said regime change is not a stated or formal goal, but could be a result of their actions. This visible difference, this divergence within the Israeli leadership, it's quite fascinating, actually. It could be strategic, a kind of good cop, bad cop, rhetorical division. One official floats the maximum demand to test the waters, while the leader keeps a more measured diplomatic line open. Or it could genuinely reflect a real internal debate, a disagreement about the ultimate goals and what means are acceptable, especially under the intense pressure of an active conflict. It just highlights the incredibly high stakes involved. Even within the same government, you're seeing different views on escalation, on the end game. Hints at the complexity of their decision-making right now.
Yeah, it really does. But when one side sees this ticking doomsday clock and the other side maybe sees a victim complex being used to justify aggression, well, diplomacy starts looking less like careful chess moves and more like a chaotic game of rock, paper, scissors, nuke. Which brings us straight to the immediate fallout, the impacts on the ground, the rapid reactions regionally, globally, because let's face it, when missiles start flying, diplomats start scrambling faster than you can say international incident. And on the ground in Israel, the impact was, sadly, very real, very tangible. Iranian missiles hit the Soroka hospital complex. That's in southern Israel. Tragically, over 200 people were wounded. Another attack reportedly damaged a prominent Israeli research institute, too. So these weren't just symbolic potshots. They caused significant casualties, real damage, which immediately raises questions about Iran's targeting. Intentional or just inaccurate. As one source smartly pointed out, unambiguously targeting civilians is usually a losing move for the weaker party. It tends to backfire, stiffens resolve, loses you international sympathy.
Yet despite those very serious strikes, those casualties, what's really noteworthy is how quickly Israel's home front command acted. They eased restrictions quite rapidly in many areas, moved from partial activity back to full activity, although with a gathering limit, I think, up to 2,000 people. This quick de-escalation of domestic alerts, this visible push towards normalcy, or at least a simulation of it, that sends a powerful message. It suggests a high degree of confidence in their defense systems. It shows a determination to prevent public panic. And it's also a strategic move, right? Projecting resilience and stability, both to their own people and, importantly, to Iran and the rest of the world watching.
But here's a critical point, a conflict point, really, that raises eyebrows among military analysts. Okay, so Israel's Iron Dome, plus the wider Israeli-American missile defense network, it proved plenty capable, right? Intercepted a lot of incoming stuff. But the cost of those interceptions, apparently enormous. Hugely expensive technology. Now compare that to Iran's missiles. Ballistic, cruise. Apparently very cheap in comparison to make and fire off. So this huge cost difference, it immediately brings up a big question. Is this actually a sustainable defense strategy in the long run? Can a cheaper, maybe cruder but massed offense eventually just overwhelm a technologically superior but incredibly expensive defense by sheer numbers and cost effectiveness? Or is the perceived success, the high interception rate, enough of a deterrent on its own, regardless of the price tag? It really does feel like a high-stakes game of missile tag, where one side's using like state-of-the-art wallet draining lasers and the other's using, well, maybe vintage toys, but lots of them. Who actually wins that long game, especially when economic endurance is part of the equation?
And this immediate impact, it absolutely rippled outwards globally, triggered widespread international reactions, a frantic scramble to get citizens out of harm's way. The United States, for example, started evacuating some diplomats from his embassy in Israel. That signals a pretty high level of concern for their own people. Canada and India, they quickly launched their own operations. Operation Sindhu, they called it, to evacuate their citizens from both Israel and Iran. India was specifically helping students get out, even arranging road travel to Armenia, then special flights home. Lithuania also moved quickly to evacuate diplomatic families. So these large-scale evacuations, they really underscore the immediate, tangible human cost. And the widespread worry among nations far beyond the actual fighting, it just highlights how easily this could spill over and affect everyone.
And while those missiles were in the air, the diplomatic phone lines or maybe the back channels, they were buzzing too, even if things were strained. Reports suggest there were indirect talks between U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araqi, but Iran's position, reportedly very firm, unequivocal actually, no return to direct negotiations unless Israel stops its attacks. Immediately. It's basically like saying, sure, we can talk after you stop punching me in the face. The U.S. even floated this idea of a regional consortium for uranium enrichment, doing it outside Iran, trying to address the proliferation concerns without letting Iran enrich at home. Unsurprisingly, Tehran flatly rejected that, said it was their sovereign right to have a peaceful nuclear program on their own soil.
And the international pressure for everyone to just calm down, it's been coming from all directions. Palpable, really. Germany called for moderation from Israel. That reflects a broad European worry about the whole region going up in flames. France, along with other European partners, they announced plans to suggest some kind of negotiated solution, pushing for a diplomatic off-ramp. Russia's Vladimir Putin, interestingly, positioned himself as a potential mediator, offered his services, called for a peaceful resolution, one that pragmatically ensures both Iran's peaceful nuclear activities and Israel's unconditional security, which sounds ambitious. The UN human rights chief urged restraint immediately, condemned the situation, calling it appalling to see how civilians are treated as collateral damage. Even Nobel Peace Prize winners Narges Mohammadi and Shirin Ebadi issued a joint plea, stop the war and choose dialogue over destruction. So you have this whole chorus of international voices. They might have different approaches, different motives, but they all share this deep anxiety about the escalation. It really shows that when the going gets tough, diplomats get talking. Even if one side refuses to even pick up the phone unless the other stops punching first.
Okay, let's switch focus a bit. Let's talk about Iran's response and its actual military capabilities, which initially, let's be honest, sometimes drew a bit of ridicule. There was this perception, especially early on, that their drone tech was, well, maybe not top tier. I remember seeing one comment like, have you seen their drones? They're as big as my 4-year-old's kite. Imagining a kindergarten art project flying towards you instead of a precision weapon doesn't exactly scream a threat, does it? But that perception, it seemed to shift pretty quickly for some people after Iran launched its retaliatory strikes. One source was quoted saying, yes, these 12 hours prove to me they have the best technology. Quite a turnaround.
Yeah, that huge gap between the initial perception, maybe based on older tech or propaganda, and the actual impact or potential. That's a really crucial point here, a point of contention and analysis. I mean, Iran launched this massive barrage of missiles and drones, but the initial reports suggested many, maybe most, were knocked down pretty quickly by Israeli and allied defenses. That led some observers to make comments like, they just lost 20 minutes after the start, basically saying the whole salvo was ineffective. And that does point to a significant gap in conventional military power, especially in sophisticated air defense systems, where Israel and its allies clearly have a massive advantage. In fact, some reports indicated Iran was already reeling a bit from the limited impact of its previous missile attacks and from the depletion of its own air defenses due to Israeli strikes back in October 2024. So their capacity to hit back effectively might have already been degraded before this latest round even started.
And then, looming over everything is the threat of escalation that could really shake up global economies. A senior Iranian lawmaker threatened to shut down the Strait of Hormuz. Now, for anyone who doesn't follow this stuff closely, that strait is a massive deal. Roughly a fifth of the world's daily oil supply goes through there, plus tons of other trades. So the threat was, if Iran's vital interests were endangered, they'd close it. Choke off the oil. It's the ultimate, if you hit me, I'll hit the world's wallet kind of move. Could send energy prices skyrocketing, disrupt everything. Meanwhile, back home in Iran, amidst all this external conflict, they apparently had a near total internet blackout, and they arrested 5 people for tarnishing the country's image online. These internal control measures, clamping down on information, suppressing dissent, they raise a really important question, don't they? How stable is the regime, really, under this kind of intense external pressure? Are these actions signs of strength, a regime confidently controlling the narrative? Or are they signs of underlying fragility, maybe deep anxiety about internal opposition, a need to squash any perceived weakness during a major crisis?
Which leads us neatly into the broader strategic picture, the implications. What comes next? This is our so what and what if section. And the phantom of regime change, it definitely hangs heavy over any discussion of this conflict. You have Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu saying, quite carefully, that changing or toppling the Iranian regime is not a stated or formal goal. But then he adds that little qualifier, it could be a result of their actions, which is intriguingly ambiguous. Does that ambiguity create space? Is it strategic denial, letting them keep options open without explicitly stating a goal that might freak out international partners? Or does it actually reflect a genuinely evolving objective, maybe something that changes as the conflict drags on? Because the historical track record for externally imposed regime change is, let's just say, Not great. It's fraught with unintended consequences.
Oh, totally. That nuanced stance from Netanyahu, it contrasts so sharply with his own defense minister, Israel Katz. Katz, as we said, directly called for Khamenei to no longer be allowed to hold power, ordered actions to actively undermine the regime. It really is like one parent saying, maybe your room will just magically clean itself if you wish really hard, while the other one's yelling, clean your room now, W, or else. And you hear warnings consistently from many Iranian opposition figures, both inside and outside Iran. They warn against the idea of a Western-backed war being the path to liberation. They often point to Iraq, the grim warning from Iraq after Saddam Hussein fell. What happened there? Not democracy and stability. It was decades of extreme and often sectarian violence and the rise of ISIS. Not exactly a shining advertisement for regime change by invasion, is it?
Not at all. And others point to Afghanistan as another, well, cautionary tale, a model of what can go wrong. An unpopular government gets forcefully removed by outside powers, only to immediately regain power once those external forces leave, leading to more instability. So it raises that fundamental question, can external military force actually deliver a desirable, stable internal political change in these really complex societies? Or does it usually just backfire, strengthen resolve against the outside aggressor, lead to these prolonged, bloody quagmires with devastating, unforeseen results? It really feels like when it comes to regime change, history is constantly whispering in our ear, be careful what you wish for, especially when you're playing with bunker busters. The internal politics, the potential for blowback, it almost always seems more complicated than the simple stories about clean strikes leading to positive transformations.
And the biggest elephant in the room, maybe the largest bunker buster in the room, is the potential for direct U.S. involvement. That's the ultimate game changer, isn't it? Reports suggest President Trump is actively weighing whether to order U.S. forces to join the attacks. A decision expected, within 2 weeks? The U.S. is apparently preparing for a scenario of strike on Iran in coming days. That sounds pretty imminent. Trump himself has expressed, his resolve, his determination, and his clarity when he says Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. Very clear stance there. But here's another one of those fascinating contradictions that just adds layers of complexity. U.S. intelligence agencies have also reportedly briefed senators that, quote, Iran is not building a nuclear weapon. So which intelligence is actually driving the decision-making in Washington? Are there conflicting assessments swirling around? Or is this mostly a political narrative that's maybe overshadowing the intel picture? It's hard to tell from the outside.
And there's a specific technical reason why direct U.S. involvement might even be considered necessary. That Fordo complex we mentioned. Israel simply doesn't have conventional weapons powerful enough to destroy it, because it's buried so incredibly deep, up to 100 meters below a mountain. That extreme depth, the reinforced structure, it makes it virtually invulnerable to standard bombs. And that's where America's specialized bunker buster bombs come into the picture. Sources suggest Trump's decision might actually hinge on whether the U.S. believes its most powerful conventional bunker busters, like the GBU-57 MOP, the massive ordnance penetrator, can reliably take out Fordo. The MOP is this enormous, precision-guided, 30,000-pound bomb, specifically designed to punch through meters of reinforced concrete or rock before exploding. Very few countries have anything like it. The fact that Fordo hasn't been hit by Israel just underscores how uniquely hardened it is. What a massive challenge it presents, even for advanced militaries. And one U.S. official reportedly made a pretty grim comment, that if the bombs can't reach deep enough, they may do it with humans. Which implies the horrifying prospect of a ground assault, even a limited special forces one, into this deeply buried, heavily fortified site.
But the political cost, the public cost of the U.S. jumping in directly like that, it would be absolutely enormous, cannot be overstated. Polling in the U.S. consistently shows very little support for U.S. involvement among Americans. People seem really weary of long foreign wars. And the argument keeps coming up. A U.S. strike on Iran could tragically mirror Russia's experience in Ukraine. What started as a supposed special military operation, a quick strike, just rapidly devolved into this prolonged quagmire. Huge human cost, huge financial cost. People also bring up historical parallels, like the Black Hawk Down incident in Somalia, a relatively limited operation, military superiority. But public opinion turned sharply against it after casualties mounted and it led to withdrawal. Plus, you've got Russia explicitly warning the U.S., cautioned U.S. against helping Israel militarily. That raises the stakes even higher, risk of direct superpower friction. So yeah, America's bunker buster dilemma, it looks like a stark choice. Is it a surgical strike, limited engagement, or is it potentially a very, very deep dive into another costly, drawn-out quagmire? Honestly, the only predictable thing about this whole situation seems to be how unpredictable it all is.
And finally, let's just widen the lens one more time. Look at the proxy play and these bigger global realignments that are happening. Iran, as we know, has a long, well-established history of using regional proxies. Groups like Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis in Yemen, using them to fight what's essentially a proxy war against Israel, against Western interests across the Middle East. Now, there's a real debate going on about how effective these groups are right now, their current strategic importance. Some sources argue these proxies have been significantly weakened, maybe even defeated by Israel in recent clashes, which would mean Iran's regional influence is diminished. But others strongly disagree. They suggest Iran is still very capable of mobilizing them. The talk of Iranian retaliation against Israel today implies they're still seen as an active and significant threat. So it raises this important question about the true reach of Iran's power projection today. How much can they really influence events through these non-state actors?
And while this really complex regional chess game is playing out, the global players, they are definitely not just sitting on the sidelines. Look at the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. They put out a remarkably strong, unified statement on this, expressed grave concern at the deterioration of the situation in the occupied Palestinian territory, particularly the violence in Gaza, and significantly, they called for an immediate, comprehensive, and permanent ceasefire, unconditional release of hostages, and crucially, unhindered, sustainable, and at-scale supply of humanitarian aid. They also specifically acknowledged the ICJ's provisional measures against Israel and reaffirmed support for a two-state solution. Now, that comprehensive statement coming from that group, it really highlights a significant international counter-narrative, a different perspective from the often Western-centric view. It showcases this fracturing global consensus, doesn't it? The active rise of a multipolar world. And that has huge long-term implications for diplomacy, for global influence.
What's also truly fascinating is watching how perceptions are shifting within the region itself. Among Arab states, some Arab countries historically, they viewed Iran as the main problem, the primary destabilizing force, maybe even the region's mad gunman. But now, reports suggest some of these same countries are starting to see Israel as the new destabilizing force or the new mad gunman. And this is forcing a critical rethink among those governments, a debate about who they need to contain more, Israel or Iran, for the sake of overall regional stability. That shift points towards a potentially fundamental, maybe long-lasting realignment of alliances and priorities right across the Middle East. It also brings Israel's own nuclear history back into focus, doesn't it? The complex, often murky story of how Israel got its nuclear weapons. Sources debate it. Some allege Israel stole nuclear material and research from the USA. Others say it legally purchased uranium under dishonest pretense, or that France gave them crucial help decades ago. That historical context, Israel's own undeclared nuclear status, it just adds another layer of complexity, another layer of perceived double standards to the current international demands being placed on Iran. It really makes you think that in this geopolitical game of tag you're it, the title of mad gunman or destabilizing force seems to be constantly swapping hands, leaving everyone wondering who's actually running the asylum,
So what does all this intricate, messy detail mean for you, our listener, trying to make sense of it all? We've taken quite a whirlwind tour, haven't we, through the Israel-Iran conflict, from that weeks away from nukes debate to the shifting sands of global alliances, changing perceptions on the ground. It seems really clear that while the headlines grab you with missiles and strikes, the deeper currents are all about these long-standing historical grievances, incredibly complex diplomatic dances, and yeah, the ever-present shadow of unintended consequences, especially in a region where every single move seems to send ripples around the globe.
Absolutely. If we try to connect all these threads to the bigger picture, what really stands out, I think, is just how incredibly delicate the current balance of deterrence actually is. Feels like it can snap at any moment. Also, the immense cost of this conflict. Not just human cost, which is tragic, but also the financial cost, the strategic cost. It's multifaceted. And then there's that enduring, maybe unanswerable question. How can international powers genuinely foster stability in a region that seems so chronically prone to volatility? The rhetoric right now is incredibly high-pitched. The stakes are undeniably even higher. And the path forward, it looks anything but clear. Just immense uncertainty hangs over the future.
Okay, let's quickly recap the key takeaways from this deep dive just to crystallize things. First, the immediate trigger, Israel's strike on June 13th. Fueled by those long-standing worries about Iran's nuclear program, the weeks away claim. Second, the fallout. Significant casualties in Israel, yes, but also these huge global evacuation efforts and this flurry of diplomatic activity, much of which seems to have hit a brick wall because of Iran's preconditions for talks. And third, the long-term implications. They are just vast. Touching on whether regime change by force is ever viable, the massive question mark over direct U.S. intervention, and this really complex, evolving web of regional proxies and shifting international alignments, including the growing voice of non-Western groups like BRICS.
And if we had to pick out maybe one or two of the most potent golden thoughts from our discussion today, a couple really resonate.
Yeah, I think the first one has to be, the question isn't just, are they weeks away, but
Yeah.
have they been doing this nuclear cha-cha for decades just for show, or is this the grand finale? Really gets to the heart of the uncertainty there.
And the second one, perhaps a bit more sobering. When it comes to regime change, history often whispers, be careful what you wish for, especially with bunker busters. A crucial reminder of potential unintended consequences.
So this all leaves us and you with some big questions to chew on, doesn't it? As we've seen this direct conflict escalate, where do you think things go from here? Will the world somehow inch closer to a negotiated settlement, maybe through less obvious diplomatic channels? Or is this new normal just going to be a perpetual state of dangerous brinkmanship in the Middle East? And maybe more fundamentally, what role do you believe external powers like the U.S., like the BRICS nations, should actually play in trying to shape this region's future? Given their very different approaches, their competing interests, we'd genuinely love to hear your thoughts on these really explosive points. Find us online, let us know what you think. Until next time, stay informed, try to stay curious, and definitely keep asking the big questions.